Hey everybody, welcome back to You're Free to Go. Thanks for tuning in again today. Mark and I love having you guys as our fans and our followers and our subscribers and all that good stuff. And please don't forget to tweet about us or comment about us, whatever this whole world of social media and so forth, whatever's in the trend at the moment. Please follow up with all that because we love hearing from you. And we love the fact that there's so much traction for this show because Mark and I really enjoy talking about our crazy ass cases. Today, Mark and I are going to talk about PPP fraud, as you call the Payment Protection Program. But first, let's bring Mark on the camera since he's out in LA. Hey, buddy, how are you?
Good. How are you doing? For some reason, I can't see you guys.
Oh, man. All right. Well, we got Eric here today running the engineering side of things in the Podcast Junkies studio in Boca Raton, Florida. How's that, Erica, for a little pitch for Podcast Junkies?
There we go.
Yep.
Perfect.
You can see us now?
Perfect. Yep.
Okay, good. I'd hate for you not to be able to see us. I'm wearing a nice new sport coat for you today, Mark. So,
Actually, we look like we're dressed similarly, and your
yeah,
tie
yeah.
looks like the same tie I have
I gotta
on.
go change my white shirt to blue, and we'll be brothers from a different
That's right.
brothers from a different mother. So yeah, we are going to talk about PPP fraud, but before we get into that, Mark, I got to tell you this crazy story that just came up. Very little quick snippet. So as you know, I grew up in Daytona Beach. My father's a doctor, retired now, but so I knew the whole medical community, right? So this morning, I get a call from a doctor back in Daytona Beach. We'll call him Dr. X. And Dr. X says to me, "Hey, guy, how's it going? I've been following your career. I love that you're such a good criminal defense lawyer. I got to tell you what happened to me." I'm like, "Okay, what happened?" He said, "Well, I got pulled over for speeding. The cop looked at my license, said, 'Oh, Dr. X, you're the so-and-so doctor, right?' 'Yeah. Oh, yeah, I've been to that practice.'" And the cop's looking at his license, looking at the doctor, says, "You know what, Dr. X, I actually owe you money from my appointment when I was there." Dr. X says to me, "Guy," so I took my driver's license out of his hand and I looked him in the eye and I said, "You don't owe me any money anymore." And the cop laughed and said, "All right, you're free to go. Let him go," right? So yeah, so he said, "Hey, I owe you money." Dr. X said, "Not anymore, you don't." So, which was kind of nervy and ballsy of the doctor. So, but he did it, and he said,
Yeah, the wrong cop, and he
"Yeah,
could think that you're trying to bribe him, right?
absolutely. It just take
On the other hand, the argument could be made the cop was actually trying to trying to start the whole thing, right?
yeah. We would love to defend a case like that."
Right.
So I said, "Well, why are you calling me? You were, as our podcast says, you're free to go. Cop, gave you the green light." And he said, "Well, that's not the end of the story." I said, "All right." He said, "Well, so that incident with the saying you don't owe me any money anymore was actually a week ago. This morning, he's speeding. He gets pulled over by the same cop. He's like, 'Guy, I'm right.
Uh-huh.
This morning, I'm speeding, get pulled over by the same freaking cop.' And he looks at me. He's like, 'Oh, doc, I don't owe you any money anymore. So what's going on?' He said, 'I'm in emergency rushing to the hospital.' And the cop says to Dr. X, 'No problem, doctor. Follow me.' So the cop turns on his emergency lights on top of the car, those blue sirens and the lights. He starts flying through Daytona Beach directly to the hospital. Dr. X drops in behind the police car. He goes, is about 6 miles. They're going through red lights. They're going everywhere. Right up to the front door of the emergency room. They go, the cop parks the car, gets the Dr. X gets out, runs in the hospital. And he's like, "Oh shit, the cop is running in right behind him."
Because there was no emergency.
Right. So the cop ran all the way in and said, "Hey, doc, Dr. X, where's the emergency? Where's the emergency?" And sure as shit, it was a total bluff.
Uh,
He said, "So that's why I'm calling you." I said, "Oh boy, what did he do?" He said, "Well, he gave me a ticket for speeding. He gave me a
oh,
threat for
oh
lying to a
God.
police officer." He said, he was worse than Martha Stewart, who lied under oath. And so he called me Martha Stewart. He said it was a mess. He said, and he threatened to put me in handcuffs and all this stuff. And but Mark, you may be right because the cop could have been, soliciting a bribe, right? So maybe the cops thought twice about it and said, "Oh boy, I better not open this can of worms." So he just gave him the ticket. So then I said to the doctor, "Just pay the ticket and all this." He said, "Yeah, now I'm debating, should I fire my nurse for not saying, of course he has an emergency here."
Oh no, that would implicate a whole bunch of labor law issues. In fact, the ticket is much cheaper than defending the wrongful termination
Hey,
case.
ain't that the truth? Yes, I said, "No, just let it go, move on, pay the ticket."
Wow.
Yeah,
Well, it just goes to show you better have an emergency,
yes,
you know?
better have an emergency.
That's a crazy story.
Right.
Well,
Yeah,
I don't know if I ever told our listeners my famous Son of Sam story,
I don't think so.
getting stopped.
No, I
All
don't
right, so
remember.
I'll make this real quick, but it is a great segue. I'm working in the DA's office in Brooklyn, New York, and I decided to take a vacation with then my girlfriend, who later became my wife. And we were driving cross country, and we didn't leave ourselves enough time to get back in time for my job and her job. So I'm speeding through the Illinois State Turnpike, and I get stopped doing 109 miles an hour.
That's pretty fast.
And, and so, for some reason, I guess the way they did it back then is you get in the back of the police cruiser, which of course had the cage, so you're pretty much secured back in there. And so he invites me out of my car to get back into the back of his police cruiser, and I'm back there for like 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and all of a sudden, more cars start showing up. And from my wife's point of view, my girlfriend's point of view, at the time, she sees it's taking longer and longer. Nothing's happening, and more cars are showing up. And the windows down, and cops are leaning in. It look like they talk to me. And by then, there's like 6 police cruisers there with about 10 cops. And she's freaking out. She doesn't know what's going on. We had just been dating for about 6 months. She figured maybe I'm with a guy who's a serial killer. What's going on? Well, what she doesn't know is I had to come up with a story, a la your doctor. Only my story was based in part in truth. Uh, they had just caught the son of Sam, the famous 44 caliber killer who had terrorized New York during that time. I think it was 75, 76, 77. I forget the exact year now. But, he was going around shooting couples. They couldn't find this guy. It became, a national news
Oh,
story
yeah, to this day, it's a big story.
to this day. In fact, they made a movie, The Summer of Sam, and it was a crazy, crazy, horrible situation. Anyway, they had finally caught him. So I had told the cop who stopped me that I was racing back because I showed him my ID as a Brooklyn district assistant district attorney,
Uh-huh.
and I said I'm racing back to because I've been assigned the case,
Right.
and now I'm just making up stuff
Oh, no.
just about the case, mostly bits and pieces from the news media and just stuff that I knew how to make up from being, an assistant DA. And he was so fascinated, he got on the horn and said, "Hey, Bob, come on down. I got this understand prosecutor." And
Oh my god.
before you knew it, I had half the department
Uh-huh.
down talking to me, and I'm telling more and more stories about the case. Well, needless to say, finally, I got back in my car. She goes, "What the hell happened?" I said, "Don't worry about it. Let's just get going." And I had a police escort going 90 miles an hour,
Uh,
5 cars in front of me with
the blue
the
sign.
lights going and everything, as though it was a presidential motorcade, and escorted me to the border.
Wow. Wow. Well, that had a happy ending on it. That's good,
Yes.
good, good. Yeah. I've got to admit, when I was a prosecutor, and as you were, we would have a badge. We had a badge. It's probably you are law
Right.
enforcement. And I used to keep it. I have to admit, I would keep it on my center console just in case I ever got pulled over. You never want to say to a cop who pulls you over, "Hey, I'm a prosecutor, I'm a police officer, or I donate to the Police Benevolent Society," or any of those things. You never want to assertively put that out there. That's where you can get yourself in trouble. So I figured, let me just leave it on my center console, and if they ever pull me over, cops are trained. Our listeners should know this. They maybe know this already. If not, they'll learn it now. When a cop approaches a car, their eyes are looking everywhere. They're looking in the back seat, the front seat, around the car, to see if anyone.
Very potentially dangerous situation.
Very,
Yeah.
very. So I figured, knowing the training cops go through, that as they approach my car and their eyes are searching the car, they'll see my badge and they'll say, "Oh." So, one time it did happen where I got pulled over. I'm pretty safe about not speeding, but pretty careful about that. But anyway, I did get pulled over once, and he came up. He said, "Oh, I see your badge there. You're an officer." Because from 3 feet away, you can't tell what type of badge it is. You just know it's a badge. So I was very clear. I said, "No, officer. I'm a assistant state attorney and so forth." And I got to admit, it did help on that run. I didn't know that particular officer. It was kind of early in my career, but now we know most of the officers.
Well, if they have the discretion, to let you, a lot of times they give you warnings anyway if you're a nice guy.
Yep.
I mean, one thing I always tell clients, always tell people I know is when you have a traffic stop, just be nice, treat them with respect.
Yeah,
Don't argue because it's a human encounter.
you're right.
And the end result is that if you're an asshole, they're going to be an asshole to you. And if you're a nice guy, you got a better shot of them, maybe giving you a warning.
Yeah, you're right. And in this case, as you said, they do have discretion. And I know that he had already looked up and saw I had no, at that point in time, I had no speeding tickets in my whole life. In fact, to this day, maybe I have one from when I was like in high school or college. So, they also see that, oh, this person has a really good driving record. So they can exercise discretion. And fortunately, that happened for me.
So, do we have some cases to talk about here today?
Yeah, we do on PPP fraud. First, let me just
Good.
set the table a little bit with some background. We say PPP fraud, but this whole thing came about during COVID, and there were a lot of crimes that occurred during COVID. The number one crime that really, really, really like skyrocketed was actually domestic violence. And Mark, just to kind of riff with you a little bit on this, I mean, can you imagine? Let's say you're in a relationship, the relationship is ending, you guys are, at each other's throats, not physically, not, literally, but you want out, and all of a sudden COVID hits, and now you're locked down. Many states locked you into your home. So two people who don't want to be together, they're in the process of breaking up, whether it's a marriage or dating or even roommates, and they really hate each other, and now they're forced to be in the house together, and they can't leave. I was in Florida, which was wide open the whole time. Somehow our governor managed the state really well that way, and it seemed to work. But most states, you were locked in for quite a while. Domestic violence, or just violence, of people living together, just skyrocketed by over 1,000%. So that was one of the crimes we saw during COVID, and during, as a result of the lockdown. But the real crime we're going to talk about today for our listeners is connected and related to PPP fraud. Now, some of you may remember that stands for Paycheck Protection Program. And this became a real serious crime, and the IRS actually has hired thousands of attorneys. The federal government hired thousands of attorneys to address this issue, and we'll get into that more in a couple minutes. But pretty much everyone applied for this PPP funding. The companies, even lots of law firms applied for it, and the companies that applied for it, they received it. And in the end, this turned out, and this is really what we're going to talk about. It turned out to be the biggest crime against the federal government in the history of the United States. Literally, PPP fraud is the largest, most significant financial crime against the federal government in our entire history. And let's talk about how could that have happened. So first, you kind of have to understand what the law was all about. So it was in March of 2020. So we all remember, I think COVID was probably here in December of 2019. I remember a friend of mine who's in like the internet business was at a convention it might have been like a rom-com or something, convention in Vegas in December of 2019. And he came home from that December 2019 convention super, super, super sick. And there were a lot of people at that convention from China and so forth. And then he, in hindsight, we know he had to have COVID. So a lot of people refer to COVID coming in like the beginning of 2020, but I think it was already here around December of 2019. But in March of 2020, that's when it was really raging. COVID was serious. The government created the CARES Act, CARES Act. And the idea behind this was they saw companies, because of the illness, people weren't showing up for work. Business was down, businesses were being closed. And the government, rightfully so, was super, super concerned about people, companies going bankrupt, going out of business, individuals not being able to pay their mortgage, not being able to have money to buy groceries. It was a major crisis, not only in the US, but of course around the world. So through this PPP, Paycheck Protection Program, and this CARES Act, the government set up this this funding. Now, what was the purpose of this during this COVID-19 crisis? It was, let's give low interest loans that are actually forgivable, meaning you get money from the government, and if you jump through certain hoops, at the end of the day, the government will say you don't owe us that money back. So let's say it's $30,000, could be $300,000, it could be $1 million, depending on what you applied for and what you got qualified for. And then at the end of the period of time, the government could say, you know what, we're forgiving it, you don't owe us a penny, but if you do, it's going to be at a very low interest. So again, the purpose was for employers to continue to pay their employees and not have to lay them off, and to keep their company afloat and not go bankrupt, not have to close the doors, not destroy commerce. There was a real concern that the whole, country, the commerce was going to collapse. And in the end, it would be forgiven if, and here's the big if, 60% of the money you got had to be used to prevent layoffs. It had to be used for payroll. So if you got $10,000, then $6,000 you had to show the government was used to make your payroll, to pay your payroll, so you didn't have to let people off. And the balance of 40%, so $4,000 in this hypothetical, had to be used for miscellaneous business expenses like rent, operational costs, and so forth. And if, as long as you did that and showed it to the government a year or 2 or 3 later, your loan would be forgiven. Your PPP funding would be forgiven. You would not have to pay it back, even at that low interest rate. So during this time, I've read a little bit about this in preparation for today. I believe there were 11 million loans, applications that were funded. So we're talking 11 million. And here's the unbelievable part. I've seen as high as $900 billion was funded as a result of this CARES Act. I've seen between $800 billion and $900 billion. That's a huge, huge number that the U.S. government gave out in loans, or originally loans that could be forgiven, so funded to companies and so forth. So,
and the key is it was without a lot of verification.
right, that's the key. Now, why was it without verification? Well, there was a really serious issue about that the public health, where people were being locked in their homes, they were dying in hospitals, that it was hitting the economy really hard and super, super fast. It had an instant, the moment COVID got here, it had an instant, immediate impact. And the federal government was so concerned that they deliberately, intentionally, what you just said, Mark, they prioritize speed of getting the money out on the streets over vetting the applications, right? So this was the stimulus, or the impetus, the genesis of fraud. Of course, 99.9% of people, followed the law, and they did it with true intention and so forth. No intention.
Well, I have to tell you, I disagree with that.
Yeah. Well,
I disagree with 99.9% of the people.
yeah.
Because I think what this government handout managed to do was to stimulate not only the economy, if it was intended to do that and had any effect, and obviously it did. More importantly, it stimulated the natural element or characteristic of greed
Right.
in a lot of otherwise law-abiding people. I know so many people who, including clients we can talk about, as we go on with this, who got money, who didn't deserve it, saw it as a free handout because there was virtually no verification. So nobody was really checking up on them. They had a great time. One client I'll talk about later went to Vegas.
Yeah.
And
No, you're right. I mean, I think the word on the street was, hey, you should apply for it because, the
Right.
government's giving it out and there's no response. And by the way, the banks were empowered with, reviewing these applications. And the government basically said, to review the applications, but to get the cash out the door quickly. That was some quotes I kept seeing as I researched for today's podcast episode. They were told to rely on the self-certification from applicants, meaning applicants just fill it out themselves, and then just rely on what they submit to you and push the cash out as quickly as you possibly can. So there were really no safeguards on this whatsoever. And as you were alluding to, Mark, people just simply lied to get the free money from the government. So that's why I said this created the largest, federal crime against the federal government in history. You're right. Human nature, unfortunately, people heard free money, no consequence, just the government's throwing it out on the street. You should just take it, And let's talk about the positive, Mark. A lot of small businesses were saved. There's no question about it. The economy, suffered, but it didn't tank. But the abuses were, I think there were threefold. One, loans were given out to a lot of small businesses who actually really had no risk of going under, and they really had no intention of cutting staff in the first place. I think I'm an example of that, and I think you are too. We didn't take PPP funding, and but there were days when the things were really bad. And I thought maybe I should, but I wasn't going to let my staff of I think my shortest employee there was 15 years with me. So, I was going to, we're going to ride it out. We're going to survive. But one of the abuses were companies who didn't even need the money took the money. Companies that had no intention of cutting their staff took the money. And then the other thing was, again, it was really for small businesses. The government wasn't so worried about the big companies that had millions and hundreds of millions and even more in their savings and so forth. It was really to protect small companies. So one of the second abuses is that small companies took the money with the intention of having it trickle up to a large business. So the intention was, we're going to get it to the big business, but we're going to apply as if we're a small business. So that was a second abuse. And then the third most big, the most offensive and easiest abuse to prosecute was that people applied who didn't even own a business. They had no business at all, and they made up a fake business and they took the loans. And that's clearly,
Yeah, I had
fraud.
one of those cases we'll talk about
Yeah,
where they made up. In fact, it was quite ingenious how they did it, and took the government a bit of time to finally wade through the various layers of subterfuge that they engaged in.
yeah,
But again, it was another opportunity for free money. And doing what I've been doing for the last 50 years, especially the last probably 35, 40 of it, representing white collar criminals or accused white collar criminals. Um, I've realized that, unfortunately, greed is prevalent
yeah, it is.
amongst humans, and all in various forms.
Yeah,
And a certain degree of greed is probably good if you don't define it as hurting somebody or stealing from somebody
right.
or denying somebody their rights. The opportunity to try to get more, to improve the capitalistic system.
Yeah.
But,
So now the government's fully aware, of what really went on, and I want to kind of bring it to a point where people understand the position of the government right now, and then we discuss some of our cases, because you got to tie the two together. What's the government doing about it, and who out there has concerns? Because the government is being proactive. So, I mean, I did start to see a little bit of proactive enforcement of, the fraud, probably around 2022, I guess. But this is really current and recent that I need to share with you. So, as of April 2026, and we're recording this episode in July of 2026, so just 2 months ago, 2.5 months or so ago, the government actually began very actively identifying and flagging delinquent and suspected fraudulent loans that were directly, given out as PPP, and the U.S. Department of the Treasury is going after these people super hard. So what they're doing is they're looking at, and this is 6 years later, they're determining, they're looking at one, who, did they really need the money? Who never really needed the money, and did they satisfy the requirements of the money? And so right now they've identified. This is an article I saw just 2 days ago in preparing, that they've initially identified $20 billion in money that was given out. It didn't say how many individuals or companies receive that 20 billion. But at this very moment, the government has identified or flagged $20 billion that was given out that they are aggressively going out and after. And as you remember, I mentioned early on, they hired thousands of attorneys at the IRS and so forth.
So this is right now going to be prosecuted, is
Yeah,
what you're
yeah.
saying.
And here's the most
And
significant part. I just referenced 6 years since COVID, right? Well,
no, it's 10.
yeah,
It's 10 under the federal statute
right.
because it involves bank fraud involving a federally insured financial institution. It's a 10-year statute of limitation.
That's correct. So a lot of statute of limitations are 5 years. For those listeners that don't understand what that means, means in many cases, if you commit a crime on the first of a year, the government can only prosecute you for that crime for up to 5 years. That's what a statute of limitations is. There's
That's a simple way of
Yeah,
explaining it. There's a
right.
lot of details involving with conspiracies, but you're right.
Right.
It's 5.
That's the way us lawyers, that's how we make a living. There's
Right.
all different scenarios that can extend, or we could argue the
Right.
government's going to argue that it extends the statute of limitations, defense going to argue no, it limited it, and so forth. But in this case, Mark, you are 100% correct. This is a 10-year statute of limitations. So we're only 6 years into the 10 years. So the government has plenty of time now to do this and to prosecute these cases, and they have staffed up for it, and they are ready to go. And one other thing to point out before we talk about cases is something a lot of people learned about in the Madoff Ponzi scheme case is the term clawback. So
Right.
That's what they're going to be doing here. So for our listeners, let's say you received $50,000 in PPP funding, and it turns out that the government's going to allege that you didn't use that money properly. You bought I think you referenced a Vegas trip or something like that. They're going to come back for that money, and that's called a clawback. They're going to say you owe us that money back, and that's what they did to me.
But Guy, let me ask you this. Since you've been researching this and you've come up with this information, obviously I know of, we've represented people where the sums were in the hundreds of thousands.
Yes.
Do you think they're going to be focusing primarily? Doesn't it make sense they're going to focus primarily on the big ticket
Yeah.
numbers
I-
rather than the small loans?
I do. But I think one of the cases that I was involved in also, if you throw out a net, it pulled in some of the small loans too, because what happened in this particular case, Mark, is there was a local person who reached out to 100 different people, and they said, look, I'm a bookkeeper. I know how to do these. I've seen the applications. I've got a contact at the bank. Pay me $2,500. I'm going to apply for you, and I'm going to get you $5,000 or $10,000, and you don't have to do a thing. I'm going to fill everything out. Just give me your name and social security number, and I'll do it all. And so what happened is, and they put in this individual put in 100 false applications. Now they're caught, right? But that got the government, after getting that person, to get all of their clients as well.
Right.
A lot of their
Right.
clients were $5,000 and $10,000, winners, so to speak, and now they're big time losers. So you're right. I mean, when the government looks at it, they see I actually know a law firm that took over $1 million, and they consulted with me. I don't think they have anything to worry about, but they start hearing about what the government's looking at these days too, and they met. We went over some things, and they're fine. But that was way over $1 million. So I agree with you. I think, certainly if I were running the government, I'd say, well, let's go for the big numbers first.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, do you have a bunch of cases that you want to tell us about,
You know,
examples?
I would say, Mark, it went on there was a run for me. I wouldn't say it was 100 cases, but I had a lot of cases. And in general, the way they were handled was, the government looked at it and said if my clients had no prior record, and they could afford to pay the money back, they would allow them to do that, even on a payment plan, and not, put them in jail. But a lot of those clients wound up with criminal convictions on their record, and it was federal, and that does affect them in life. But their priority was keep me out of jail, of course. So in general, that's my experience. And again, I had countless cases, not quite 100, but I had a lot. And if they had never been in trouble before and they were able to pay back or get on a payment plan. They stayed out of jail, they stayed off, probation, but they would get like a conviction on their record. So that's over a general, and then I have some specifics if you, unless
I got one I want to
yeah,
tell about,
you,
if you don't mind,
yeah, share.
because it's uh, just picture this. Let's picture it like a movie. Um, Two FBI agents pull up to a transmission repair shop, um, and there's two bays, where the cars are on lifts, and they go in and they ask for a particular name. Let's call him Ralph right now. Turned out to be my client. Ralph gets out from under the car. He's got grease on him, and they ask him, "Are you Ralph so and so?" He said, "Yes." And they ask, date of birth, blah, 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 such and such home address. He said, "Yes." They said, "Well, we're investigating a PPP fraud, and we just want to let you know that you don't have to talk to us right now. You may want a lawyer, but we would like to interview you." Well, Ralph very wisely decided um, not to talk to them. He was kind to them. He was nice to them. Said, "Let me get a hold of my lawyer, and then my lawyer will call you." Well, he didn't have a lawyer at the time, but somehow he was referred to me. Anyway,
Right.
the bottom line is Ralph, the mechanic, working on transmissions covered with grease, was, according to the federal government, the CEO of a major tech company that he had obviously fraudulently, fictitiously
Wow.
formed on paper anyway, with 100, I think it was 111 employees. And this was obviously during COVID,
Yeah.
and applied for a loan through PPP through an accountant who, as it turns out, was dirty. And that's how he got caught, because the accountant was doing this for a lot of other people. And when they caught the accountant immediately fessed up and, dimed out everybody else
Oh,
in order to reduce his exposure.
that's right.
Anyway, he got a total of 870 something $1,000, I forget the exact amount, intended to cover payroll, and other necessary costs to keep the company alive. All this going on while Ralph is fixing transmissions, okay, on Ventura Boulevard here in LA. So he calls me, and we sit down. He tells me everything. I call the assistant U.S. attorney on the case. He tells me everything I've just mentioned, what the problem is, and that Ralph is going to be prosecuted, and he can either plead guilty and work something out, or just fight it. In which case he's going to lose, and he is going to lose. But the big problem for Ralph was the amount of time he spent in Vegas with this money. Ralph thought that he was some kind of big shot in Vegas, acted like it, was staying in like the Emperor's Suite at Caesars,
Wait,
or one of the
you,
major hotels.
hey, you're a big shot. You've stayed in that suite before.
No, no,
I've
no, no.
seen
I've stayed in.
pictures of you in
I,
suites that are like three
no,
stories tall with everything.
yeah, no. That was the closet. But anyway, and he, we all know how Vegas works, or any gambling casino. The more you win, the more they want you back, the more they treat you well, because eventually the odds are against you. You're going to lose money. And that's what happened. And, he went out there with, I think he told me like 50,000 something. And he wound up coming back with like $300,000.
Wow.
So now he is hooked. So he keeps going back and back. And I forget what casinos he was playing at. But the bottom line is he wound up losing probably close to 500,000 of the 800 and something that he got.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so it was a completely indefensible case. He didn't have the company, it was a fiction, didn't have those employees, and he spent the money gambling. So, what does Ralph tell me? He says, "We've got to come up with a defense to this case." So, Ralph's defense was that he was spending this money, actually, that the accountant screwed up everything. The accountant was supposed to set this up for the garage because he was buying other garages, and he was
Huh.
going to Vegas to raise as much money as he could to buy more garages.
Uh,
I said, listen, I wouldn't lay out that defense in the Magic Kingdom at Disney World,
no,
let alone in front of a jury.
right.
I said, you got to plead guilty. So what does Ralph do? He fires me and hires another attorney.
Oh boy. You know,
And they apparently went to trial.
wow.
I heard that he was convicted. I didn't handle the case, but I don't know how he got any attorney to actually think the case was triable. That was what I like to call weekend at Bernie's. You're
Right.
walking the corpse around the room.
Yeah, well, I think I once talked about a case where it was a sexual battery, and the victim had my client's DNA on, and the defense that my client presented was that they had sex. She was a hooker, and he picked her up, and they had sex in his car, and she da 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 da, da and I didn't buy it. I said, we have a lot of experience with juries, Mark, between the two of us, 500 juries, probably if not more, and but we did focus groups. Like he insisted, and he was a very wealthy person, so we hired a focus group, which is like a mock trial. We did like
Yeah.
3 or 4. But there are times when a client presents to us a scenario like he did in this case about trying to raise the money for garages, and we just know, not only just as our normal life experiences as a human being, a rational, thinking person, but from our professional expertise in front of juries, we just know when it's not going to fly. And so in this case, you try to give him that advice, and unfortunately, he didn't follow it because you probably could have, negotiated a much better deal than he wound up being sentenced to after.
Well, actually, what I was trying to do was to get him to cooperate against um, the accountant, even though the accountant had already started cooperating with the government. One of the things that our listeners should know about, and we see this all the time, is a lot of times when people who are caught committing crimes and decide that their best way out is to, I like to use the term dime out,
Right,
like something out of TV, somebody else. In other words, cooperate, testify, agree to testify, or at least tell the government about who else was involved. And then they become the darling of the prosecution. They're the main witness. They're going to get a sweetheart deal. More often than not, I have found that they don't tell the government everything about what they've done.
sure,
And that is the way to attack the case. And we discovered at some point in before he fired me, we had discovered this accountant had been involved in a lot of tax fraud
mm,
because Ralph had a friend who was the one who referred the accountant, and the friend was the one who used Ralph as a tax preparer, fired Ralph because Ralph was doing all sorts of strange things. And I had my financial investigator, who used to be an IRS agent, look into a bunch of stuff, interview some people, and lo and behold, we think that Ralph was the accountant, that is, I forget his name,
hmm,
was committing other crimes. So that would have been an inroad to work out a deal for Ralph with the government, even though the person he'd be talking about had already begun cooperating. Government hates it when they find out. I mean, we were prosecutors. We would hate it when we find out that our agent or our police officer is dirty, or if a cooperating witness is not told us the incomplete truth.
right,
So anyway,
yeah.
that's what happened in that
Well,
scenario. You have some, I'm
yeah, well,
sure.
it's interesting that you mentioned the trial. The case went to trial because none of my cases went to trial. But the defendants who I referenced earlier, if you had no prior record and you could afford to pay the money back, even up front or on a payment plan, that you could be kept out of jail and so forth. But I had defendants with prior records, and the government did offer them prison. They weren't going to negotiate on that aspect of the case. And those clients, we discussed going to trial, and none of them did. Like I said, I didn't have none of my cases wound up going to trial on the PPP fraud, but every one of those clients, they wanted me to present a defense to them, which is interesting because your client wanted you to present a defense, which you knew wasn't going to fly, and this one wasn't going to fly because legally it wasn't sound. But every one of those guys who had, these prison offers, their defense to me was, shouldn't the government or the bank be prosecuted and not me? They're like, they're the ones that push this money out there so fast. If they all said to me the same thing. It was almost like they were all in the same chat room. They said if the government had taken literally 5 seconds to Google online, ABC interior, design
Hmm.
company of Orlando, Florida, they would have seen that that company did not exist. So, they needed 3 to 5 seconds online, and they would see that this company that I just applied for isn't even incorporated. It has no employees. It has no payroll. It has so why should I be prosecuted? So they all wanted to use that as the defense that basically they were kind of coerced and influenced and persuaded and manipulated into applying for these loans. And obviously that was not going to be a legal defense that could be presented at any trial, or even in a motion to dismiss before a judge. So but I understood it. Look, the banks, they gave the application to the bank, and the bank, a day later signed off on it, and there was really no scrutiny of the app.
Well, there's no question that there was an incredible amount of negligence. It's not criminal conduct, but
Right.
negligence on the part of the bank. And more importantly, the government. Every time the government gets involved in something like this, handing out money, more often than not, they've not built in the proper safeguards
Right.
and checkpoints. Um, in this case, it's understood why things happened the way they did because of the urgency, the financial situation, the speed by which they needed to accomplish this. But it was fraught with disaster. But people can't use that as an excuse for being greedy and making up a lot of crap.
Right.
And that's
No.
what they did.
Yeah, at the end of the day, people lied, made things up, and that was not going to go well in front of any jury. So, because you're going to wind up picking a jury, believe me, everyone the government picks on that jury is probably going to be someone who, either applied and didn't lie on their application, or they didn't even apply for the money. So, it's going to be impossible to pick a.
It's interesting you say that because, I've tried a lot of criminal tax cases defending people accused of tax fraud. And, everybody always says to me when we decide we're going to trial and we're picking a jury, we're not going to have a problem because everybody hates the IRS. No one's going to want to,
Sure. Yeah.
be in the favor of the government because they hate paying taxes. And I said, you're absolutely right. But what they hate more than the IRS are because they have to pay their taxes. They hate people who don't pay their taxes.
Right, right, right. And we talked on we're kind of flirting with this topic right now that we talked about probably in one of our first 10 or 15 episodes, which was the concept of a jury pardon, where maybe they think, yeah, the person lied on the application, that's a fraud, that's wrong, but let's forgive them a little bit because the government didn't scrutinize the application. The government should be held accountable to some extent. So there, I think that's, if this case had gone to trial, that probably would have been the only Hail Mary or prayer you could have for a possible not guilty verdict, is that you just get, try to put the people in the shoes of your client and say, well, you know what? Yeah, he did something wrong, but at the end of the day, it was only $10,000, and the government really threw it at him, and they need to be held accountable. But yeah,
So,
these guys, there was no way to defend these. So
so what's the lesson for the people out there who are potentially exposed since there is this
yeah,
strike force, I'll call it, out there ready to pounce, is be prepared to pay some back. I always thought it'd be funny to write like the little comical book, and I was going to call it "Steal but Save,"
yeah, that is a great
because at
topic.
the end of, it's
Yeah.
really interesting, but it's really true. The amount of clients that I've had who've committed major fraud and have blown all the money.
Hmm.
Because in addition to facing prison time, um, there's the financial component. They're going to be hit with a restitution order, some cases forfeiture, um, and if they don't, if they have the ability to pay money back, that often is a great tool in the negotiating process. As well as I do, when we're trying to talk to the government about working out a deal. If the case is truly not defendable at trial, then you have to be realistic. What's the alternative? And it's interesting because a lot of people always ask me, well, what do you really do? And I say, well, a lot of times we go to trial, and more often than not, people are convicted. The federal government's conviction rate is like 96%, something like that. Um, I actually have a high acquittal rate considering the government's conviction rate, but it still is just a minority of cases that we actually win at trial. So we try to mitigate. And often that means the example I give is, imagine you're jumping out of a plane. I give you a parachute. It's not going to completely break your fall, but you may break a leg or an arm or whatever,
Hmm.
but you'll survive. And that's what we do a lot. We work out a deal if we can, if the case is not defendable. And the deal is you do much better than you would have done if you go to trial and you lose, and you wind up doing significant time. But in any event, you're going to have to pay money back.
Yeah,
And that's where it becomes important.
the steal and save. I've never heard you mention that name of a book you've thought about, but it just triggered a memory of mine from one of my early cases. 30 plus years ago, where this gentleman. We all know the infomercial industry. This gentleman made probably $100+ million as an expert in that infomercial world. And what he did was he actually would promote something, and then the person would pay, let's just call it $100 for an item that they saw in an infomercial. Well, the client would not mail that product to the customer. He'd receive the $100 and he wouldn't mail the product. And he'd hold it and hold it and hold it. And a small percentage of those customers would never follow up. So that became pure money. And a big percentage, let's just call it, I don't remember, it's so many years ago, let's say 85, 90% of the customers would follow up and say, hey, where's my, let's call it they bought a hammer. Where's my hammer? I paid $100 for it. It's been 10 months already. Where's my hammer? And eventually, after delay, stall, eventually my client would mail them that camera for $100, right? So the idea is that on 10 to 15% of those people, he never had to even send them the hammer, so he pure profit. But on the others, he used their money and earned interest off of it for 6 months, 8 months, 12 months, a really long time, until he eventually sent them the hammer, right? So it was very, very profitable. They actually changed the laws. The federal government changed laws, and they named it after my client. I'm not going to go there, though, because it's it never hit public, so it was never in the news. So we'll just call him Mr. V, whatever. There are actually Mr. V laws for that. That if you are doing an infomercial, you have to provide that product within it's like 30 days. And if you can't deliver it to the customer within 30 days, you have to immediately refund their money or give them the option to extend it and so forth. So there are actually Mr. V laws for what he was doing. Well, then he had to pivot. So what did this client do? Again, it's the steal and save concept. He then, because when the government eventually prosecuted him for that, by the way, he had saved so much money, he paid a couple million in fines, and he wasn't prosecuted. Case closed. He pivoted. Next thing he came up with, which is a scam. Let's call it, be honest, a scam where he started infomercial, and he would show you this beautiful, gorgeous, let's call a piano, a big, beautiful piano that you'd see Elton John or Billy Joel playing these beautiful pianos, right? And it would be, it's a $25,000 piano. We can sell it to you for $9,999, and people would send the money, and then they would receive a piano that was like nothing compared to what they saw in the infomercial. It was not even a tenth. It totally was misrepresentation. But he saved. A lot of people complained. He eventually got prosecuted for that. He had saved enough money. He paid a big fine. He kept himself out of jail for that as well. So this is a guy who literally lives by your book title, steal but save, because he always knew this was literally, Mark, it was his business plan to do what this white collar scam, save enough money because he knew eventually he'd get caught, but then he'd have the money to pay fines and fees and so forth and restitution.
You know, it's interesting you say that because uh, one of the biggest problems in these cases, in these financial crime cases, is the government obviously wants to put your client and our clients in jail. And the victims could be very angry and they want the same thing. But at the end of the day, what the victims really want is their money back. And that's what we call restitution. But quite often, our clients don't have the ability to make that restitution right away.
That's-
So they're subject to this restitution order. When they get out of prison, if they even go to prison, then they have a probation officer, called supervised release officer, who then, they got to pay X amount of dollars a month. They put them on some kind of payment plan. And, it's the half life of uranium,
mm,
58 years before they be paying all the money back.
that's right.
So the question is, at the end of the day, putting all these people in jail, while I clearly understand the reason for it, it's punishment, does it really accomplish the purpose of restituting the victim? I had a case where there was significant fraud. It was a couple of $1 million. My client was working in a legitimate business at the time. He had been prosecuted that could earn a lot of money. And I got together with the lawyers for all the victims. And when the time came for sentencing, they all came into court and they backed my proposal to the judge that my client not be sentenced to prison, that he be on home detention, but allowed to work so he could pay them back.
Right. Yeah.
And it was 2 years, and he paid them back in a year and just several months.
hmm
Everybody was happy. And my client then went on the straight and narrow ever since.
Yeah.
So
There's a lot of different types of white collar crime or business crimes as we know them, and with the statutes on crimes, there's sentencing guidelines, and
right.
every white collar crime I've seen in the sentencing guidelines, it says that restitution is the top priority to make the victim whole. So that's a big part of this. And by the way, with this, Mr. V, there now second law that was passed about the replica or what you show on the infomercial has to be consistent with what it can't be a replica.
Are there infomercials anymore?
Yeah, I don't think they
I
really
think
are.
we put them out of business
Yeah,
with
yeah.
podcasts, right?
Yes, they're now called podcasts. So that guy though, he kept buying his way out of all these crimes, and that's as you said, he stole but he saved. Referencing back to the case I talked about earlier on, where an individual would get a bunch of their friends and neighbors and so forth to give them the authority to fill out these applications and apply. You had talked in your earlier case about the accountant maybe testifying against the accountant. The government did come to me and say, we want all the customers of your client, or because I was kind of involved in a lot of different ways, we want them to testify against him. And so some of them did turn against that bookkeeper. So you're right, that is something the government wants to go after the bigger fish. I want to share one case real quickly. It could be an hour episode, but I'm going to rush through it a little bit, just since we've been on for about 45 minutes already. So I get a call from a lawyer, and he's one of the brightest. I could honestly say one of the brightest lawyers I've ever known. And he had some experience with criminal law and just some general civil litigation and so forth. And he says to me, "Guy, I'm in some real trouble. I went through some very serious personal troubles. I didn't really get too deep into it, but I think they were drug related. I think there were some, emotional, mental health issues, some family issues, and he said, and it led to some major financial hardship. He said, I was down and out. I was desperate. My practice was suffering because I wasn't able to focus, and I filled out 25 fraudulent PPP applications, and he said." The applicants, they were friends and neighbors and this and that, and he said they paid me to complete the application, and then I also took a percentage of the money that I got for them. He said none of them signed off on them. I've made up numbers. I just did everything wrong. Everything was fake. Company names fake. Everything fake. and I took the money, and now one of those people told me they're going to call the police on me. They're going to go to the police and they're going to report it. And again, this was a very involved case, but I'm just rushing to the punchline, so to speak here. So he said, "Guy, what do I do? I trust you. I've always looked up to you and so forth, and I know you will advise me correctly." So we talked about, would this person really go to the police? Well, the odds were that they wouldn't, because they would also understand that they allowed someone to fill out an application fraudulently, and they ultimately did sign the application.
And did they get money?
Right, and they did get the money, exactly.
All right. Well, they're guilty of a crime.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so most of the time people won't report something if they think it's gonna, get themselves in trouble, right? So I said the odds of them going to the police or the feds or reporting you is probably pretty slim. Really, I think unlikely, but it is a risk that we have to consider. Um, so, but so I said I don't think anything's going to come of this, but let's stay in touch. And he's like, well, let's keep talking about it. A week or two or three later, he called me. It was probably more like a month later. And he said, nothing's happened yet. He said, but Guy, I really can't live with what I did. He said, I'm a lawyer. I took an oath. I know I went through tough times. He said, but I shouldn't have done what I did. And I feel horrible. And what we wound up deciding he was going to do was literally walk into the U.S. Attorney's office. And as I said, he had dabbled in criminal law, so he had some relationships over there. If he walked in, they would know his name, recognize him, and so forth. And he literally, after we strategized and discussed it, he walked into the U.S. Attorney's office and he surrendered. He confessed. He told them everything he did. He came completely clean. He told them he had been consulting with me but had not officially retained me. But that that if there was going to be a case here, if they were going to prosecute him, that I would be working on his behalf, and I would be pro bono because he had lost all his money and so forth. So that's what he did. And the U.S. Attorney's Office, they sat with it for about 3 months, I think it was, trying to decide what do we do with this case. And in the end, because I think when this gentleman, this lawyer colleague, went in and talked to them, he was very heartfelt and sincere, and they saw his sincerity, and they realized, the fact that he came in and threw himself on the sword. They took that very seriously, and in the outcome, and again, I was somewhat involved, but we wound up, no charges were ever filed, so I never had to enter a court appearance per se, what we call a notice of appearance or a precipice with the court. They wound up an agreement where he agreed to surrender his bar license, so he's no longer an attorney, and he got on a payment plan. It was he really didn't have much money, so like you just referenced, it was like a 2-year deal. He got it paid off in a little over a year. My guy had a 5-year deal. He wound up borrowing money from family and friends, and he paid back all the restitution in under a year, and it kept him out of prison. So
Wow, that's a great result.
yeah,
But
yeah,
as we all know, it's a very risky
very
question. Do you self-report or not? And I've had this scenario a couple of times, and I'm sure you have, where clients come to us and then there's a question, well, is this going to be discovered by the government? What's the likelihood of that? And there's no way you could absolutely accurately say for sure. On the other hand, if you go in and self-report, sometimes it does mitigate. It does even result in the fabulous, consequence you had in your case, which
yeah.
was non-prosecution. And sometimes you can work out deferred prosecution deals in the federal system, uh, but it's a very difficult conundrum.
Yeah.
There's no right or wrong answer, and I often tell my clients this is, as much of an art as it is a science. And
Yeah.
so,
All right.
but you had a great result, and that's
Yeah.
fabulous.
Yeah, and as we wrap up here, Mark, I think we have some good things to look forward to. We're in the next couple episodes. You and I have decided we're going to do. Everyone knows that franchise Girls Gone Wild. We've decided we're going to do a one called Lawyers Gone Wild or Attorneys Gone Wild. Attorneys that went off the reservation and had some real
Yeah,
problems, and that's kind of what happened in the case I just shared. So we'll do a
yeah.
whole episode about Lawyers Gone Wild. So that's stay tuned for that, listeners, and also stay tuned as soon as Mark and I close off in a second. There'll be the commercial from Milburn. We're very appreciative to our sponsors, and you may have noticed we were running 3 commercials lately. We've just been running 1 commercial at the end of each episode, but we appreciate our sponsors. So Milburn Men's Clothing will be up in a second with that. But Mark, why don't you, as always, sign us off? Been another great.
Well, I think we had a great time today, and we'll do this again very soon.
Love it.
So, ladies and gentlemen, until the last or next time, that is, you are free
Free
to
to
go.
go. Your Free to Go is sponsored by Milburn Men's Clothing, where top athletes shop for sharp, tailored style. And whether Mark and I are in the studio or the courtroom, Milburn dresses us for success. Mention YFTG and get 10% off at Milburn Men's Clothing, which has been providing the finest in men's clothing and suits since 1946. Call 651-645-2922 or visit www.milburn.com. Everything expressed and discussed in this episode are the opinions and experiences of attorneys Guy Fronstin and Mark Nurik and their guests. All ethical rules are complied with. Attorney-client privilege and confidential information is not shared or released during these episodes, and names, dates, locations, and other identifying information may be changed to protect confidentiality. Topics are embellished, and none of the statements made constitute legal advice and should not be considered or relied on as such.